In our next session, we're going to deal with criticism. We were going to do it in this session, but I've decided to give a bonus section, and I think this one could be truly life-changing for anybody that's watching. I'm actually taking this from my new book that's coming out, The Joseph Principles, and what that book is all about. It's about navigating your way through trials, problems, adverse situations, and so on. But what we're going to do right now is take a portion from this book, and I'm going to share with you something that is truly life-changing. And it relates to both criticism and failure and fear of failure. So that's why I'm putting it right here. And it's called treasure hunting. Before I tell you the principle and how to do it, let me share a story. Back in 2019, a 90-plus-year-old woman decided to move out of her little tiny house in a village in France and move into an assisted living facility. And she didn't have a lot of money or anything, but she had some things that at her home that she didn't want to just throw in the trash. So she had a little auction company come out, and they put everything in her house up for sale, and that she couldn't take with her to the assisted living place. And they went ahead and they had an auction day where people came over, and it's not like where they're openly bidding, but they're putting in bids, and they sold what was sellable for a sum total of $6,000. So that was her furniture, some decorative stuff and so on. Well, there was one item in her kitchen that didn't sell. She cooked all of her meals on a hot plate. So that tells you how big her kitchen was. And this was just a little painting about this big that was right above her hot plate. So it kind of had collected grease and grime over the years and years of cooking. It was so insignificant she couldn't remember when she bought it. It had always been there, she thought. She bought it decades ago. And she thought it was probably some little religious painting that, she doesn't remember where she bought it or anything. And the person with the auction company said, okay, now what do you want to do with that? We're taking everything else to the dump. Is that what you want to do? Or do you want to take it with you to your assisted living center? And she said, no, I don't want it. It's, look at it. It's not worth anything. Just go ahead and take it to the dump. Well, he took a second look and he said, we probably ought to get this appraised just in case, it might be worth something. And so she said, okay. So he took it back to their home office. They put it out for appraisal, and it came back, and they were saying, you've paid her. This painting, our appraisers say it's worth between $6 and $7 million. And she thought, wow, that's amazing. Let's put it up for auction. So they put it up for auction. Their experts were way off. It sold for $26.9 million. Now, why do I tell you this story? This woman had lived with this painting most of her adult life. It had always been there. She had always lived like a pauper. She never spent extravagantly. Her kids, treated her as if she had no money, because she didn't. They didn't ask for her for stuff. And it had always been there. She didn't know it, but she had a treasure that was worth almost $27 million, and it was right there. It could have changed her life. It could have changed the lives of her children. It could have changed the lives of her building, of her little village. She could have had scholarship programs, health programs. She could have benefited her community so much, because she wasn't into selfish things, and it was all there. And sadly, shortly after the auction, she passed away. But here's my point. She was living as if that didn't exist. She was living as someone with very little money in their savings and checking account, even though she had something that was, I mean, how do you put value? And maybe you'll go back and look at all the paintings your parents have now. But anyway, it was a hidden treasure. Well, you and I walk around every single day with hidden treasures inside of us, and we don't even know it. We live our life, just like that lady, as if they don't even exist. Guess where they are hidden? They're not hidden in our bank accounts. They're not hidden in a cedar chest in the bedroom. They are hidden in our subconscious, in our mind and in our heart. And guess where they hide? They hide in our trials, in our past trials, our past adversity. Think of some of the bad things that have happened to you. Here's the good news. Here's the amazing news. Gary Smalley taught me that in every trial, every adversity, there is a treasure that can bring more to our life on the positive side than the adversity ever took away from us on the negative side. Is that crazy? But it's true. And to prove his point, Gary told me about a time when he was first teaching me this decades ago. He told me about this time where, well, before I tell you that, I'll tell you that in a minute. Just remind me of the football player. But Gary had the concept. He said, you know, in every oyster that ever has a pearl, it starts out as a grain of sand. And the grain of sand becomes lodged in the most tender, fleshy area of the oyster. And it is horribly painful. So for 3 years, every single day, the oyster is secreting a fluid around this irritant, and it ultimately encases the irritant, and it grows and it grows and it grows. And guess what it grows into? Of course, a pearl. Think about how smooth a pearl is. I mean, it is just glass smooth. So it takes all the pain away. But it always starts out with that irritation, that adversity. And Gary said that's what made him realize that we're no different, that every irritation in our life, every terrible thing that happens to us, it starts out as a terrible thing, but God, in his mercy and grace, actually builds a pearl around that. Now, if you don't find that pearl, you become irritated at that, and that irritation can become bitterness, resentment, anger, the inability to forgive, and all of those things color who we are to the point to where we're not near as attractive to other people as we would be if we weren't resentful, if we weren't bitter, if we weren't callous, if we weren't critical and condescending and unforgiving and angry. All of those things that come to us, Zig Ziglar put it this way. He says, every trial either makes you bitter or better. And how you respond or react to that trial determines whether you get better or bitter. And he uses this illustration. He said, when you react to an adversity, that makes you bitter. He says, if you go into your doctor and he says, hey, you've got a terrible situation here and we're going to give you this medication. You try the medication, you come back 2 days later and the doctor says, oh my gosh, look at the reaction. That's a bad thing. If on the other hand, he says, look at this. You're really responding to this medication. That's a good thing. So do we react or do we respond? If we react, that creates anger, bitterness, resentment, regretfulness, all sorts of things. If we respond, on the other hand, we get better. Well, that's Zig Ziglar, but now we're coming back to treasure hunting. Every irritation creates pearls. Now, the Bible says this, and it's really cool. It's in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, starting in verse 16. It says to people who are are followers of God, followers of Christ, it says, for momentary light affliction is producing for you, wait until you hear this, an eternal weight of glory, far beyond all comparison. In other words, when these afflictions come, even though you don't know it, they're creating an eternal gift, an eternal treasure that goes way beyond anything. So he says, therefore, even though our outer man is dying, yet our inner man is being renewed day by day. For momentary light affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory, far beyond all comparison. So we look not at things which are seen, but things which are unseen. For things which are seen are only temporary, but it's the unseen things, the invisible things, that are eternal. So now how does that come into treasure hunting? Well, Gary told me about a situation, and this is in my book, where he was asked to go to breakfast with a professional football player and the football player's wife. Gary had a real ministry with pro athletes that a lot of people don't know about. And so they go to breakfast, and this couple says, you know, we really love each other, but our marriage is in the tank. We're really having problems, and we don't know why. But we've lost our desire for intimacy. We don't have intimacy with each other anymore. And Gary said, and Steve, she was a beautiful wife. And they had a couple of daughters, young daughters that were really cute. And so Gary said, okay, well, let me ask some questions. And he started asking questions, and then he turned to the wife and he said, let me ask you, have you ever been sexually abused by anybody? And she hung her head down, and Gary said the wife was a very melancholy person. She wasn't giddy, she wasn't happy as far as showing her happiness. She wasn't what I would call sparkly at all. In fact, she was known as a melancholy person by her friends and by their relatives. But he asked her, have you ever been sexually abused by anybody? And she goes, yes. And he said, would you mind telling me about it? And she said, from the time I was 6 years old, my dad molested me every single day until I was 16. And when I was 16, I ran away from home, never to return. And I finally got away from it. He later did it to my sister, and that's when my mom finally took action. I don't think she believed me, but when it happened with my sister, younger sister, after I left, she believed it. And my dad's in prison now. And Gary goes, whoa. He said, that's really tough. He says, have you forgiven your dad? And she says, yeah. She says, and I go see him once in a while, and I've told him I've forgiven him. And Gary then asked another question, and her husband got a little irate when he asked this question. He said, have you thanked God for your dad? And even though it was horribly wrong, have you thanked God for what your dad did to you? And she kind of backed up and she says, oh, Gary, no, how could I thank God for my dad? How could I thank God for what he did for me? And Gary said, okay, that's our effort today. We're going to treasure hunt this. And he told her about the oyster. And he said, what your dad did is horrible. And he said, what I found, the greater the irritation, the greater the offense, usually God makes an even bigger pearl. So we're going to go looking for those pearls right now. And what he didn't tell her is that second question, have you thanked God for it, showed that she, even though she thought she had forgiven her dad, she really didn't understand forgiveness. When you understand forgiveness, and we'll do a session down the road, I really deal with it in the new book. We show what real forgiveness is, forgiveness from the heart, sincere forgiveness. A lot of times we think it's impossible to truly forgive some horrible offenses. Good news, guess what? it's possible when you understand forgiveness and when you know the steps to take. And there's some specific steps that we'll get into later, not today. But so he said, okay, I'm going to ask you some questions. He said, and Gary always traveled with a yellow pad. So he pulls out his yellow pad and he said, let me ask you, do you ever let your daughters stay overnight in anybody's home? And she said, absolutely not. And he said, why? She said, because I don't want them to be molested. He said, what if you know the parents real well? She said, Gary, I don't know if you can ever know everybody that well. And you don't know who the parents may have over. A cousin, an uncle, a friend. We don't know that. So we just have a flat rule. And Gary said, how about, and he writes something down and he writes something down. He said, how about relatives? Will you let her spend the night at a relative's house? And she said, no. And she said, once again, we just don't know what could happen. I don't want my daughters to ever go through what I went through. He said, okay. He said, well, right away, here's some pearls I see right now. He says, we're not done, but let me just tell you, they're amazing. He says, you have become protective of your children. Who knows what you've already spared your little girls from? You don't know it. They could have been molested 2 years ago, but they weren't because you've become wise and protective. He says, second, you've become vigilant. He said, I can see that. He said, she says, but we let them have their girlfriends over for sleepovers and their cousins, girls' cousins, for sleepovers. He says, okay, so you're lovingly vigilant. Oh, he said, that's great. He says, let me ask you another question. He says, just think, your daughters right now have never been molested, and you're the reason. What a great pearl. He says, have you ever met anybody, any other woman that you've met who was likewise, maybe not from her dad, but was molested? She said, oh yeah, I've met a few. He says, let me ask you a question. When you find that out, what do you do? What's the first thing you say? She says, I don't say anything. He writes that down. She says, I just start to cry, and I usually hold them, embrace them, and after I've cried for a while, I tell them how sorry I am that they've had to go through that and that I understand how bad that hurts. He says, you don't say anything? No. I just tell them that I'm available. And anytime they want to talk, anytime, 24 hours a day, I'm there. They can call me, I'll come over, whatever. Wow. He says, I can't believe the pearl. She said, what? He said, do you know that when you choose not to talk, when they tell you that, that's something most counselors spend their entire life, and they never get that. They want to talk as fast as they can. You've learned the perfect Christ-like response. You've become everything that that person needs at that moment because you don't speak up. You just hold them. You just cry with them. How big is that pearl? He says, we don't learn that in school. I've gotten my master's degree in counseling. I never learned that. But I learned from people. And you've done it perfectly. He says, when you do finally start to talk later on with that person, what do you say? She said, Gary, I just listen. And if God gives me something to say, I say it. But talking's really not the important thing. He goes, I can't even believe your wisdom. He says, I can't even believe the pearls. Well, by this time, she's crying. And he asks her again, you think you could thank God now for your dad? Because that's what he wants. He says, in all things and for all things, give thanks, for this is the will of God concerning you. She said, oh, Gary, I am so thankful just for my own kids, just for my friends that you've brought out. She says, yeah, I am thankful. He said, then why don't we pray? And she prayed, and she thanked God for her dad. She thanked God for the horrible things she had to endure so she could become the person that she's become, so she could learn what it means to have mercy and compassion, vigilance and wisdom, protection, in a practical way that really counts. So that was treasure hunting. And he said about a month later, he ran into her. He said, tell me what's new. She said, well, our marriage is amazing. The intimacy's come back. She said, I started working at a shelter downtown for abused women and children. And she said, Gary, the most amazing thing. She said, after 1 week, one little 6-year-old girl comes up to me and she says, Mrs. T, will I ever be happy like you? She said, Gary, everybody at the shelter thinks I'm the happy one. I'm the one with the sparkle now. They look at me and they see a happy person because I've really become a happy person. That's treasure hunting. And you can do that with any trial you have ever been through. I went through and treasure hunted my loss of 9 jobs. And I made this incredible discovery. Here all this time, I thought I was getting fired because I was doing a bad job or I was losing interest, all this stuff. I found out that to be successful in job number 10, which lasted 35 years and made me and my partners all multi-millionaires, that to succeed in that job, I needed 9 skill sets. Guess what? Every one of those jobs gave me one of those 9 skill sets, and there was no duplication. You can start treasure hunting right away. In a nutshell, you take the things that hurt you the most in life, and you begin to ask, what did I get from that I wouldn't trade for the world? And then you ask the people that witnessed it, can you see anything positive that came into my life from that negative experience? And usually they'll come up with 2 or 3 pearls, just like Gary did with this wonderful woman. So that's treasure hunting, and that's our bonus. Next, we're going to look at criticism. How to make criticism, transform it from your worst enemy to your best friend. And when you learn these techniques, you'll never fear criticism again. We'll see you then.